That's great. Thank you very much, Annalisa. That's very kind. I'm conscious of the countdown clock, and Sue, you mentioned it before. And if I stand in this circle, it's this one here, right? Yeah. And if you stand in this circle, at the end of 10 minutes, it actually goes through the floor. So I'm going to make sure that I avoid it when the 10 minutes is up. But thank you so much for those kind words. Look, very briefly, we could talk all day about the London Olympics and Paralympics, but in 10 minutes, I think there's probably 3 things I can put on the table, and we can decide if there's more you'd like to talk about in the Q&A. As Annalisa said, I had the immense privilege of being in charge of the diversity inclusion programs for 5.5 intense years from 2007 to 2012. And following that intensity, I had the privilege to go back to the States and do some thinking about it, and to actually stop your career and decide to be authentic and say, you know what, I'm not going to go to the next job. I'm going to take 6 months, have a sabbatical, and actually think about what the hell just happened, and write about it and think about how we can apply it to other organizations. And so as a consequence of that, midway through, I'm not claiming I have the answers, but there were 3 things which really kind of stood out for me. To try and put this in context, as I said, you need a day to talk about the Olympics and Paralympics. But let me try one anecdote. Putting on the Olympics can be described in 7 stages. Stage 1 is celebration when London won, because nobody thought we would do. Stage 2 was shock when you signed the host city contract and thought, oh my goodness, we can never do all that. Stage 3 was then despair. Stage 4 was then search for the guilty. Who got us into this mess? Followed very logically by stage 5, which was, of course, the persecution of the innocent. Stage 6, as anybody who saw the games last summer will hopefully concur, was celebration again, when it went really, really well. And stage 7, my personal favourite, and one stage which anybody who's worked in corporate life may be familiar with, is, of course, the glorification of the uninvolved. So that's LOCOG. 3 things. Thing number 1 is about understanding. What do we understand about diversity and inclusion? Who here has responsibility within their own organisation, directly or indirectly, for gender equality and diversity and inclusion generally in their organisation? Okay, it's about a quarter of the room. Okay. My personal view is that every hand should be up, because I think everybody has responsibility for gender equality, men and women, everyone at all levels in the organisation. And in terms of understanding, there are 3 subpoints which I think came out for me. One was what we might call Diversity 101 programs, which are based from a very compliance perspective. So training, legal auditing and so forth, which we tried at LOCOG at the beginning, but I was at the back of the room and I was cringing. I felt that it was having a counterproductive effect. And I looked at the response of people in the room, particularly the men, and it wasn't working. In fact, it was actually taking the opposite effect and putting people off diversity and gender. The second part of understanding, I think, that's worth mentioning is Diversity 2.0 programs, if you will, which focus a lot on subconscious bias, implicit association, and things which are really, really interesting and can be incredibly individually empowering. But they're limited by the fact that it's an individual scale of action. The third part of understanding, which I felt we achieved to some degree at the Olympics, was systemic change, as Annalisa mentioned. And that's about changing the system and realising that you can't do it all on your own, and the results would be worse if you did. And I think that understanding about diversity inclusion, that it's a collective responsibility, it's part of the system, was a really important point for us in achieving the success we did last summer. I think a second thing that we took out of the Games was leadership. And I was discussing with a couple of colleagues earlier that leadership is quite a male concept. Well, why is that? And why does it need to be? For me, leadership is a group process. It's not an individual egotistical crusade. It's not the alpha male. It's not to be confused with authority. Leadership is a very organic group process. It's about getting a group of people, a team, an organisation to confront a problem and to say, how do we solve that problem? How do we actually better it for the sake of all of us? How do we position diversity rather than as a zero-sum game where some win at the expense of others, as really enlarging the pie? How do we really improve the collective lot for men and for women? I was talking earlier with a colleague and I said, are you a feminist? And she said, yes. I said, so am I. And I said, often I get jokes, laughs by particularly men if I say that. But everybody should have their hand up, and everybody could be a feminist because it's in everybody's interest. And that concept of leadership as a group process was, I think, really critical to helping people lead in the Olympics and actually deliver work that was in their own interests and in the wider interests. So, for example, we had a diversity board composed of men and women and people from all levels of the organisation to review all of our work. And we assessed it not just from a technical excellence point of view, but from an inclusion point of view. So when we delivered the ceremonies, or the torch relay, or our volunteer programme, how were they technically, but how are they also from an inclusion perspective? Were we really going to deliver everyone's 2012? So leadership for me is not an individual process, it's a group process. It's not management, leadership is about empowering people. And I'm very reminded of the Indian feminist writer, Sariju Sahu, who said that in terms of gender equality, women just need to declare themselves an equal to men. And that process of self-actualization is just, let's start from there rather than start from back here and work towards it. Let's just start where we want to be. And she can say that, it's harder for me to. I think the third thing that we took out of the Olympics was about the importance of delivery. So if we understand diversity, inclusion, and gender equality, if we lead on diversity, inclusion, and gender equality, then we should be able to deliver on that. And there's three things, I think, that we delivered on relatively well. One was in terms of the workforce, where diversity programs are traditionally focused. And in terms of the workforce, we, for example, set up group interviews. So rather than going down a 101 route of compliance training, rather than going down a 2.0 route of subconscious bias training, although it can be really helpful, we went down a route of changing the system. So by interviewing in groups, it reduced the individual subconscious bias of an individual interviewer. Because even the most ardent opponent of diversity would think it odd to put through 10 blokes in one go every single time. And we didn't do that necessarily through immense thought about diversity theory. We did it because we didn't have any time, we didn't have any money. But those circumstances forced us actually to think creatively and think, if we do hire in groups, wow, you get a much more diverse result. And there's a lot of literature I've discovered to back that up. A result we got in procurement through the supply chain, an area I knew nothing about 5 years ago, was through being transparent. And the procurement team at LOCOG were almost all men, but appealing to the fact that they wanted reduced costs, which can be achieved by increased competition, which can be achieved by greater transparency in the supply chain, also allowed in minority-owned businesses and greater supplier diversity. And we ended up with 14% of our contracts going to women-owned businesses. And I'm convinced that only happened because we were transparent, because we adopted a commercial approach to transparency, which was also helpful in terms of supplier diversity. And the third thing I think we got out of it was in terms of service delivery. So when you actually deliver for the customer, and we had 9 customer groups who were all extremely demanding, how does that play out in terms of inclusion? And I think by creating a sense of competition between departments to compete on inclusion, to compete on gender equality, to compete on diversity, resulted in a better achievement, a better result than compliance or training alone. So for example, by benchmarking all our departments on their hiring record or on the delivery of infrastructure, we created things which wouldn't have been possible from an individual initiative. Sarah Attar was the first Saudi woman to ever run in Olympic Games last summer. And even though she was 300 metres and 1.5 minutes behind the second to last placed runner, she got a standing ovation and completely biased coverage from the coverage in the stadium. And that was not just because it happened, it was because there was a lot of work going on to think about how do you make a systemic impact. It wasn't just chance that we had every single team with women on it for the first time ever in history last summer. There's a lot of work gone into that. So I think for me, in terms of understanding, in terms of leading, in terms of delivery, I would leave you with the thought that compliance training has its place, 101 has its place, individual 2.0 work programs have their place too, subconscious bias training and individual action is important, but moreover than anything, something that we forget about at our peril and don't talk about enough is the system, because you can't do it all on your own and the results would be worse if you did. And for me, particularly when you think about gender equality, and I'm one of 3 men in the room today, No line or queue for me at the Loos. When we think about that, 50% of the population and 50% of the workforce is not a minority. Yet we treat this as a minority issue. This is a systemic issue. Right? This is too important to be left to an initiative, to 101 or 2.0. This is a systemic issue, which I believe if we treat as such and work as such, we can deliver as such. And that will benefit all of us, women and men. Thank you.